The Senate will come to order. Members, please stand for the prayer. Today's chaplain is Reverend Jeff Hansen from Spirit of Hope United Methodist Church in Golden Valley. And following the prayer, please remain standing for the Pledge of Allegiance.
Would you bow with me? Gracious One, we could begin this session by inviting you here, invoking your name, seeking your presence, and then speak of the honor that it is to have you join us when we ask. But you are here, whether we invite you or not. We could begin by thanking you that we get to be here, that we get to be at all, on this third day of May, over a year after a pandemic was declared, and the world has changed, and thousands upon thousands who were here then no longer are. We are, and humble gratitude is fitting indeed. We could simply dive into what we want from you, what we think we need, what we believe to be best for all, and seek your blessing on our requests, our agendas, our visions. But are they yours? So, let us do this instead. Let us ask what you want from us, what you expect of us, how you hope we will engage and think and speak and act in relation to the work of this day, by first listening for your voice within ourselves, in the words of those around us, whatever side they may be on, and in the words we ourselves are moved to offer after we open ourselves to your wisdom, your grace, your will for all your people. We are grateful for your presence, for your promise, for your willingness to speak to and through us. May we listen well. Amen.
Secretary will take the roll.
Senators Abler, Anderson, Bach, Benson, Bigham, Carlson, Chamberlain, Champion, Clausen, Coleman, Swazinski, Dames, Dibble, Dornick, Draheim, Duckworth, Dietzick, Eaton, Eichhorn, Eakin, Fate, Franzen, Friends, Gazelka, Goggin, Herr, Hoffman, Housley, Howe, Ingebritsen, Isaacson, Jasinski, Johnson, Johnson, Stewart, Kent, Kiffmeyer, Klein, Karan, Kunish, Lang, Latz, Limmer, Marty, Matthews, McEwen, Miller, Murphy, Nelson, Newman, Newton, Osmic, Pappas, Port, Pratt, Putnam, Rarick, Rest, Rosen, Rude, Senjum, Tomasoni, Torres, Ray, Utke, Weber, Westrom, Uyghur, Wickland.
Pursuant to Rule 14.1, the following members intend to vote under Rule 40.7. Senators Anderson, Carlson, Champion, Clausen, Coleman, Dames, Duckworth, Dietzick, Eaton, Eakin, Fate, Franzen, Goggin, Housley, Isaacson, Latz, Newton, Osmic, Rarick, Senjum, Torres, Ray, and Wickland. A quorum is present. Members, we have a few conference committees that are meeting right now, so I'm going to run through the excuses right now for those members on the conference committees. Pursuant to Rule 12.5, Senator Limmer moves that the following members be excused for a conference committee on Senate File 970 at 10 a.m. Senators Limmer, Ingebritsen, Johnson, Matthews, and Latz. On that motion, all in favor say aye. Opposed say no. Motion prevails. Pursuant to Rule 12.5, Senator Pratt moves that the following members be excused for a conference committee on Senate File 1098 at 10 a.m. Senators Pratt, Rarick, Draheim, Housley, and Eakin. On that motion, all in favor say aye. Opposed say no. Motion prevails. Pursuant to Rule 12.5, Senator Draheim moves that the following members be excused for a conference committee on House File 1077 at 10 a.m. Senators Draheim, Duckworth, Dames, Pratt, and Dietzick. On that motion, all in favor say aye. Opposed say no. Motion prevails. Pursuant to Rule 12.5, Senator Kiffmeyer moves that the following members be excused for a conference committee on House File number 1952 at 10 a.m. Senators Kiffmeyer, Lang, Curran, Howe, and Carlson. On that motion, all in favor say aye. Opposed say no. Motion prevails. We will begin on the agenda with the third order of business, messages from the House. The Secretary will read the first message.
Mr. President, I have the honor to announce the passage by the House of the following Senate files herewith returned. Senate File number 151, a bill for an act relating to the state lottery. Senate File number 1020, a bill for an act relating to commerce. Patrick D. Murphy, Chief Clerk, House of Representatives.
There's no action required on that message. The Secretary will read the next message.
Mr. President, I have the honor to announce the passage by the House of the following Senate file as amended by the House, in which the amendments, the concurrence of the Senate is respectfully requested. Senate File number 193, a bill for an act relating to health occupations. Senate File number 193 is herewith returned to the Senate. Patrick D. Murphy, Chief Clerk, House of Representatives.
Senator Benson.
Mr. President, I move that the Senate do not concur in the amendments made by the House to Senate File 193, and that a conference committee of 3 members be appointed by the Subcommittee on Conference Committees on the part of the Senate to act with a like conference committee appointed on the part of the House.
Discussion on the Benson motion. Seeing none, all those in favor say aye. Opposed say no. Motion prevails. The Secretary will read the next message.
Mr. President, I have the honor to announce the passage by the House of the following Senate file as amended by the House, in which the amendments, the concurrence of the Senate is respectfully requested. Senate File number 1470, a bill for an act relating to emergency powers. Senate File numbers 1470 is herewith returned to the Senate. Patrick D. Murphy, Chief Clerk, House of Representatives.
Senator Gazelka.
Mr. President, I move that Senate File 1470 be laid on the table.
On that motion, all in favor say aye. Opposed say no. Motion prevails. The Secretary will read the next message.
Mr. President, I have the honor to announce the House refuses to concur in the Senate amendments to House File number 2128, a bill for an act relating to state government. The House respectfully requests that the Conference Committee of 5 members be appointed thereon. Liebling, Schultz, Gomez, Pinto, and Schumacher have been appointed as such committee on the part of the House. House File number 2128 is herewith transmitted to the Senate with a request that the Senate appoint a like committee. Patrick D. Murphy, Chief Clerk, House of Representatives.
Senator Benson.
Mr. President, I move that the Senate accede to the request of the House for a conference committee on House File number 2128, and that a conference committee of 5 members be appointed by the Subcommittee on Conference Committees on the part of the Senate to act with a like conference committee appointed on the part of the House.
Discussion on the Benson motion. Seeing none, all those in favor say aye. Opposed say no. Motion prevails. The Secretary will read the next message.
Mr. President, I have the honor to announce the passage by the House of the following House File herewith transmitted. House File number 1947. Patrick D. Murphy, Chief Clerk, House of Representatives.
There's no action required on that message. Next, we'll move to the fourth order of business, first reading of House bills. The House file listed in the agenda is given its first reading and referred as indicated. We'll move to the fifth order of business, reports of committees. Senator Gazelka.
Mr. President, I move the committee reports printed in the agenda be adopted.
On that motion, all in favor say aye. Opposed say no. Motion prevails. We'll move to the sixth order of business, second reading of Senate bills. The Secretary will read the Senate file numbers.
Senate File numbers 592 and 2269.
Second reading. We'll move to the eighth order of business, introduction and first reading of Senate bills. Listed in today's introduction calendar are Senate file numbers 2483 through 2488. These Senate files are given their first reading and referred as indicated. Moving to the ninth order of business, motions and resolutions. We have a couple authors' motions listed in the agenda. We'll take those authors' motions as one motion. All those in favor say aye. Opposed say no. Motion prevails. Senate resolution numbers 50 and 51 will be referred to the Committee on Rules and Administration. Remaining under motions and resolutions, Senator Gazelka.
Mr. President, I move for a brief recess for the purpose of appointing a conference committee member.
On that motion, all in favor say aye. Opposed say no. Motion prevails. The Senate's in recess. The Senate will come to order. Senator Gazelka.
Mr. President, is there a privilege report at the desk?
There is. The Secretary will read the report.
Excuse me. Senator Gazelka from the Subcommittee on Conference Committees recommends that the following senators be, and they hereby are, appointed as a conference committee on House File Number 2128. Senators Benson, Abler, Utke, Karan, and Hoffman. Senator Gazelka moves that the foregoing appointments be approved.
Discussion on the Gazelka motion read by the Secretary. Seeing none, all those in favor say aye. Opposed say no. Motion prevails. Remaining under motions and resolutions, Senator Gazelka.
Mr. President, pursuant to Rule 26, I designate the following bill be made for special orders for immediate consideration. Members, the sheet with the bill is on your desk.
Members, the bill up for consideration is number 33 on general orders, Senate File 173, Senator Newman.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have to note that you moved through the first 9 orders of business so rapidly. I would have hated to have been a court reporter trying to take down what you were saying. Mr. President, Senate File 173 is a voter protection bill that supports free and fair elections. And it supports free and fair elections in the following ways. First, voter ID detects and prevents voter fraud and does so by providing election judges with the proof the person proposing to cast a vote is in fact the person that they say they are. Voter fraud is a matter of historical fact, irrespective of those who do not support voter identification requirements. Voter fraud is very difficult to detect. As a matter of fact, I heard Senator Pratt on the Senate floor a week ago telling us about his involvement in detecting fraud in the banking business and how difficult it was to detect. Voter ID won't stop voter fraud, but it will help increase our ability to detect and thereby stop at least some voter fraud. Next, voter ID provides for provisional ballots for those who do not have the necessary government-issued identification card when casting their ballot. Provisional ballots are a positive voter protection measure as recognized by 46 states that have adopted provisional ballots. That's 46 of our states have adopted provisional ballots. Only North Dakota, New Hampshire, Idaho, and Minnesota have failed to pass provisional ballots for protection for voters. I would bring to your attention, members, I did have a handout that I've indicated with states that currently provide for provisional balloting, and I simply wanted to bring that specific states to your attention. So, provisional ballots protect voters in 2 different ways. First, it gives a voter the opportunity to provide election officials with the necessary proof of identity so that their vote will be counted. Second, it protects those whose legal vote has been effectively canceled by someone who has cast an illegal vote. Number 3, voter identification moves Minnesota into the 21st century by modernizing our system with tools like digital photography, the ease of transferring information, and the ease of acquiring necessary documents. In that regard, I have provided you with a handout that states with voter ID provisions. There are currently 34 in the nation that I would bring your attention to. Finally, voter ID serves to safeguard voter confidence. Public confidence in the integrity of our electoral process encourages citizens' participation in our democratic process. I acknowledge that some deny there is any problem with voter confidence. With them, I disagree. All we have to do is listen and open our eyes. There are millions of voters across this nation that are losing faith in that their vote counts. I have a computer file full of emails from voters and constituents across the state of Minnesota that are literally begging us to go forward with this voter ID bill. And they are begging us to do so because they have lost faith that their right to vote counts. And they have lost faith because they believe voter fraud is robbing them of their meaningful vote. Adoption of voter ID will not eliminate their fear, but it is a beginning. And we must try to convince those who have lost faith in the integrity of our election system that it is free, it is fair, and that their vote counts. At this point, I'd like to directly address some of the inaccurate assertions that revolve around this bill and around voter ID bills in general. First, the assertion that there is no voter fraud. That is simply not true. No matter how many times you say it, no matter how many different ways you say it, voter fraud happens, and it has happened in this country since its inception. Bloody Kansas, Tammany Hall, Chicago corruption, other examples too numerous to mention, all point to the fact that voter fraud does in fact occur. Just take a moment to study a little bit of history yourself, and it will be confirmed that voter fraud is a reality. As a matter of fact, voter fraud as a matter of historical fact was confirmed by the United States Supreme Court opinion that is the basis of this bill. The next inaccurate assertion is that voter IDs in general, and this bill specifically, disenfranchise people. That is not true. Remember that provisional balloting protects the right to vote. It does not impede it. Also, this bill has a provision in it that if a voter is unable to obtain the necessary documents to prove identity and residence, they may sign an affidavit so stating, and they will be allowed to vote. Absolutely no one is prevented from voting by reason of this bill. Next, I challenge the accuracy of the fiscal note that came out on this bill. In terms of the challenges, in terms of the assumptions and the costs calculated. I want to read you just a very short passage out of the fiscal note that's found on page 25. And the department is using information from 2016. It gives us the number of the projected population of those who are over 18 and therefore eligible to vote. It estimates the number of Minnesotans that are over 18 with a driver's license or a state ID, and from those or with those two documents, it then extrapolates that there would be 788,952 people who would be eligible, or 18% of the voting public would be eligible to obtain a voter ID card. And I believe that that the departments have grossly overestimated the total number of people who would be eligible for a voter ID card and would actually try to obtain one. Here's what the departments missed in terms of counting those who would be eligible to apply for a voter ID card. They did not take into consideration tribal licenses. They did not take into consideration military licenses. They did not take into consideration those who have receipts for new or renewals for driver's licenses or Minnesota ID card, which under the bill would authorize those folks the ability to vote without getting a voter ID card. There is on Section 13 4 pages of documents that, used in combination, allow an individual to vote. And if they have those documents, those various documents, 4 pages of them, you're not even eligible to try and obtain a voter ID card. And those folks who have those 4 pages of combination of numerous documents were not counted by the departments in preparing the fiscal note. Next, there is a certain number of eligible voters who simply don't vote. And they won't vote whether or not they have the necessary documents or not. And the departments did not take into consideration that class of individuals when coming up with the total number of folks the departments feel would be applying for a voter ID card. That 788,000 person number that I was talking about. So my point is, in terms of the fiscal note and in terms of the documents that allow people to vote, it is much broader than just a driver's license or a Minnesota ID license. There are pages of lists of documents in Section 13 in the bill. All you have to do is look. And with those documents, you are able to vote. And remember that if, for any reason, you can't come up with those documents, you simply have to sign an affidavit saying, I am who I say I am, I live where I say I live, and I'm eligible to vote in this precinct. I tried to get those documents, I was unable to get those documents, and I want to vote. At that point, the election judges must allow that individual to cast a vote, and that vote counts. Then finally, in terms of assertions regarding photo IDs, I would challenge Minnesota voters to think about the various activities in our daily lives that require photo identification. Look at the handout that I prepared for you. It's the one it's got a big black box in it. And in it, I have listed all of the different items in our daily lives that I could think of that require the use of a photo ID to participate in. I missed COVID vaccinations. That's not in the list. But I've got some staff that told me they had to show a photo ID in order to get a vaccination. I don't know if this is specifically true or not, but I believe that if an individual wants to vote in a union election, a photo ID is required in terms of identification. But note, voting in Minnesota, such a photo ID is not required. And I see that as a huge, huge inconsistency. I think that the voters in Minnesota recognize that their right to vote is probably their most precious constitutional right. Intuitively, I think they know that if they lose their freedom of speech, if they lose their freedom of the press, if they lose due process, if they lose the right to assemble, intuitively, I think they understand that if they have retained the right for full and free elections, they can still get their constitutional rights back. Lose the right to vote, and it will take a civil war to get your freedoms back. Minnesotan voters know this. They believe this, and that is why voting rights raise such passion and why they overwhelmingly support this voter protection bill, which in turn supports fair and free elections. I would draw your attention to the various polls that I have provided for you. My favorite is the one from CNN, in which 64% of those polled by CNN feel that requiring photo identification would make elections more fair. Mr. President, that is my plea to this body to think very seriously about the protections that voter ID, photo ID provides for the constituents that we represent. With that, Mr. President, I do have one kind of a cleanup amendment that I would like to offer, and then I'll take a seat. And I would offer, Mr. President, the A7 amendment.
Senator Newman offers the A7 amendment. The Secretary will report the amendment.
Senator Newman moves to amend Senate File Number 173 as follows, page 2, line 24, delete. This is the A7 amendment.
To the amendment, Senator Newman.
Thank you, Mr. President. As so often happens, staff comes in and helps us kind of at the end. This is an amendment that has been prepared by nonpartisan staff, and the purpose of it is threefold. First of all, the bill currently requires monthly reimbursement to Minnesota Department of Health for searches for birth records. This amendment changes that, or turns it back where it was actually, to an annual basis, and by doing so, no additional cost will be required, and Minnesota Department of Health would not require any new FTEs. So we're simply going from a monthly to an annual reimbursement rate. There is a one-time appropriation in the bill for $270-some thousand, I think it is. And that one-time appropriation is to take the lag time from when the birth certificate searches occur and when the first annual reimbursement would occur. And I am told that after that one-time appropriation, that one-year lag time, then the program will begin to sustain itself and no further appropriations would be needed for that. That is, Mr. President, the A7.
Discussion on the A7 amendment. Senator Port.
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise in opposition to this amendment. Changing this from paying out annually to paying out annually instead of each month puts the burden of bearing those costs on the local offices that issue these birth certificates and things. They would have to issue them for free, but still do all of the work, and they would not be reimbursed until the end of the year. And so that would be borne by our local offices in all of our counties, and then also by the Minnesota Department of Health. And pushing that off until the end of the year might make it cheaper overall for the bill, but our counties would bear that cost. Thank you.
Further discussion on the A7 amendment. Senator Newman.
Thank you, Mr. President. Nonetheless, I would, on the basis of what staff has recommended to us, I do wish that the A7 would pass. I would request a roll call vote.
A roll call will be granted. Any further discussion on the A7 amendment? Seeing none, the Secretary will take the roll. Members in rooms 303, 206, and the President's office, please come to the chamber to vote. I'll call on Senator Frentz to report the votes of the members voting under Rule 40.7. Senator Frentz.
Thank you, Mr. President. Senator Carlson votes no.
Carlson votes no. Senator Frentz.
Senator Champion votes no.
Champion votes no. Senator Frentz.
Senator Clausen votes no.
Clausen votes no. Senator Frentz.
Senator Dietzick votes no.
Dietzick votes no. Senator Frentz.
Senator Eaton votes no.
Eaton votes no. Senator Frentz.
Senator Eakin votes no.
Eakin votes no. Senator Frentz.
Senator Fateh votes no.
Fateh votes no. Senator Frentz.
Senator Isaacson votes no.
Isaacson votes no. Senator Frentz.
Senator Newton votes no.
Newton votes no. Senator Frentz.
Senator Torres Ray votes no.
Torres Ray votes no. Senator Frentz.
And Senator Wickland votes no.
Wickland votes no. Senator Jasinski.
Thank you, Mr. President. Senator Anderson votes aye.
Anderson votes aye. Senator Jasinski.
Senator Coleman votes aye.
Coleman votes aye. Senator Jasinski.
Senator Dames votes aye.
Dames votes aye. Senator Jasinski.
Senator Goggin votes aye.
Goggin votes aye. Senator Jasinski.
Senator Housley votes aye.
Housley votes aye. Senator Jasinski.
Senator Senjum votes aye.
Senjum votes aye. Senator Jasinski.
Senator Draheim votes aye.
Draheim votes aye. Senator Jasinski.
Senator Duckworth votes aye.
Duckworth votes aye. Senator Jasinski.
Senator Howe votes aye.
Howe votes aye. Senator Jasinski.
Senator Ingebrigtsen votes aye.
Ingebrigtsen votes aye. Senator Jasinski.
Senator Johnson votes aye.
Johnson votes aye. Senator Jasinski.
Senator Kiffmeyer votes aye.
Kiffmeyer votes aye. Senator Jasinski.
Senator Lang votes aye.
Lang votes aye. Senator Jasinski.
Senator Limmer votes aye.
Limmer votes aye. Senator Jasinski.
Senator Matthews votes aye.
Matthews votes aye. Senator Jasinski.
Senator Osmic votes aye.
Osmic votes aye. Senator Jasinski.
Senator Pratt votes aye.
Pratt votes aye. Senator Jasinski.
Senator Rarick votes aye.
Rarick votes aye. Senator Frentz, any additional votes? No. Senator Jasinski.
Thank you, Mr. President. Senator Curran votes aye.
Curran votes aye. All members having voted who have the desire to vote, the Secretary will close the roll. There being 35 ayes and 29 nays, the motion prevails. The amendment is adopted. Further discussion on Senate File 173. The Secretary will give the bill its third reading.
Senate File Number 173, a bill for an act relating to elections requiring photo ID to register to vote and to vote.
Third reading. Final discussion on the bill. Senator Port.
Thank you, Mr. President. We've had kind of a tidal wave of misinformation about our democracy, about voting, and about the last election. Lies that were designed and spread by elected officials, even our former president, to manipulate and mislead their constituents. This misinformation, these lies, they have deep, lasting impacts on our democracy. And we saw some of those dangerous consequences play out in a violent insurrection at the Capitol on January 6th. The myth of voter fraud and the resulting push of restrictive legislative proposals is unacceptable. We should be doing work to solve actual problems instead of imposing policies that place deliberate barriers in place of people exercising their right to vote. I'm disappointed that here in Minnesota, we're one of 43 states trying to pass anti-voter legislation. These bills all across the country have the effect of disenfranchising voters, like Jim Crow laws of the past. Bills like this one primarily disenfranchise Black, Brown, Indigenous, New American voters, and the elderly, seniors, students, the disabled, and LGBTQ communities. They're powerful tools that work to keep communities from exercising the right to vote. The big lie about voter fraud is just that. It's a lie. And voter ID wouldn't solve for that. It would only solve for one type of voter fraud, and that is voter impersonation. There are 0 cases of that happening in Minnesota. It's not a thing that happens in this country. And voter ID would only solve for that issue. It's $8 million and more ongoing that would be spent on a bill that would have the effect of disenfranchising thousands in order to fix a problem that does not exist. We have very real work to do. And this bill is a partisan political use of our time that has no companion in the House, was not included in the omnibus state gov bill or the overall budget targets that the governor would surely veto. We should be working on solving real problems for Minnesotans. Teachers are getting laid off because we haven't passed school funding. We have a housing crisis in Minnesota. People can't afford their health care. There are very real problems we need to be solving for Minnesotans, and this is not one of them. I do want to address one note on the cost of it. The bill author referenced what he thinks is much too high of a number of Minnesotans who don't have an ID. But to be clear, the fiscal note only assumes that 10% of those in a midterm election and 20% of those in a federal or in the presidential election would actually get the ID. So that is, the cost is only 10 or 20% of that number. It's not that whole big number. And that's $8 million and more ongoing every year after that. We were sent here to do Minnesota's work, to solve real problems that we're facing every day. We should be doing that instead of this. I ask for a red vote.
Further discussion on Senate File 173. Senator Putnam.
Thank you, Mr. President, members, and pals. I rise to offer a perspective on this bill. I'm an actual published historian of American democracy, but you don't have to be a historian of democracy to understand that our voting and our elections have always been imperfect. That's the nature of human behavior, and it's the nature of history. We're never going to get a perfect election because we've never had one. That doesn't mean we should make efforts to make them better. But when we think about history, I think sometimes we think too comfortably in terms of progress or evolution. All things used to be awful, but now they're great. That's not the way history works. That's not the way history has ever worked, especially when we think of the history of democracy. Things have gotten better, more inclusive, more democratic, and then they've gotten worse. Things have gone well, and then they've gone poorly, all based on the decisions that people like us made. There's nothing natural about the progress of democracy or about history. It's about human beings making decisions. Human beings like us making decisions in a moment like now. Now take, for example, Reconstruction. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments expanded voting rights, expanded democracy in this country. Maybe some of you don't know, but the first black congressman was elected in 1870. We had 7 black congressmen during Reconstruction. But you know what happened during Reconstruction? As federal laws became more expansive and people became more able to participate in democracy, state laws became much more repressive in a number of different ways. So that after Reconstruction, we didn't have another black congressman until 1929, almost 50 years. Reconstruction was a powerful and interesting phase of American history because it was so full of opportunity and potential, and yet simultaneously so full of repression. So while federal laws, like I was just suggesting, became more expansive and more open, at the state level, you had things like black codes, where a person of African descent would have to carry proof that they were employed everywhere they went or they could get arrested. That happened in the South in the 1860s. But something that happened specific to voting rights is just as important. We've all heard stories about grandfather clauses, and the idea that you would have to be able to recite the Constitution from memory in order to vote. That's important. That specific provision is important because on its surface, it seems fair. On its surface, it makes perfectly good sense. Would we hope that every American citizen would be able to know the Constitution well enough to recite it? It looks fair on its surface because it appears to apply to everyone, but in reality, it's not. Democracy is not an idea, it's a practice. The idea of democracy might make us feel good, but the actuality of democracy is much more important, and I hope that we focus our attentions on that today. So I'm not trying to bore you with history, I'm trying to make a point about today. Today we can be so comfortable in the stories that we tell ourselves that we don't put the effort in to find out reality and the practical consequences of the decisions that we make. We find stories to support our feelings and indulge in the arrogance of fear, thinking that others are out to get us. Mr. President, members, I know some Democrats. We are not organized enough to actually create widespread voter fraud. Not out of lack of desire, we're just not competent. I don't think we could manage widespread voter fraud if we wanted to. And here's the thing, close elections happen, and I know that better than most of us in here. As many of you probably know, I won by 315 votes in my election. And when we think of close elections and we think about voter security, counted, and we want to be afraid of voting irregularity. But what is more irregular than votes that should have counted not counting? Close votes are decided by the votes we don't count, just as much as they are by the ones that we do. I want to go back to this idea of democracy as an idea versus democracy as a practice or as a real concrete thing. Because like I said before, on its surface, voter ID sounds fair. I completely concede that. On its surface, it makes sense. It really does. But in terms of its actual practical consequences, it is deeply anti-democratic. And that needs to be our focus, not on our ideas, but on the implications for actual living Minnesotans. My grandfather did not fight at the Battle of the Bulge for an idea of democracy. He fought to make it real. Fannie Lou Hamer did not organize for the sake of the idea of democracy. She organized to realize democracy. Voter IDs laws sound fair, but in reality, they aren't. Real fairness respects everyone's capacity for self-determination. Real fairness demonstrates faith in the people and faith in democracy. That's the real fairness to which we must aspire. Voter ID isn't really fair, and we can do better. Mr. President, members, I urge a negative vote.
Further discussion on Senate File 173 as amended. Senator Kunesh, followed by Senator Frentz. Senator Kunesh.
Thank you, Mr. President and members. This bill has direct implication on the ability or the willingness or welcoming for our new Americans, our new voters, to participate in this democracy. Minnesota has had a long history of welcoming new Americans from all over the world. I think of my Irish, my French, my Czech ancestors, along with my Lakota ancestors, and how my Lakota ancestors were not allowed to vote until the 1950s. That's what was going on back in those days. But we have that opportunity right now to make sure that everyone who comes to this country looking for a democratic opportunity has the right to vote and the opportunity to vote in the easiest, best way. I've had many conversations with communities that voting can definitely have an intimidating and complicated process for everyone, especially if somebody is new to our system of government and has limited knowledge of the English language. My children's father is Lebanese. He immigrated to Minnesota to study and get away from the Civil War, and his family followed. And I remember the first time he got to vote. It was a pretty joyous occasion for all of us. And then when his parents, his elderly parents, came and went through the process, when they got to vote, how important that was. Those are milestones in people's lives. And those are the sort of things that our great America subscribes to. That's why we invite people to come again and again. Had it not been for those family and the community members who could assist and help those new learners, those new immigrants understand our process, so many of them are disenfranchised. Why wouldn't we make the process more accessible to everyone who wants to be represented in our democracy? That's what all of our ancestors, every one of us in this chamber, unless you are a Native American, that's what your family aspired to when they immigrated to Minnesota. Because when we add these new and complicated and restrictive barriers, it not only disenfranchises our new Americans, but it intimidates them from even voting for the very first time. According to the U.S. Government Accountability Office, restrictive voter ID laws have resulted in a 2 to 3% reduction in voter turnout. The voter ID law alone could affect over 50,000 Minnesotans and disenfranchise a base could affect over 50,000 Minnesotas that were disenfranchised on the 2016 election turnout. And it's not even to mention the hundreds of thousands potentially shut out by provisional balloting. Members, as elected officials, it is our moral and our civil responsibility to make this process more welcoming for the first-time voters, and then consider those expansive practices such as providing translated language resources in languages other than English. I found it an interesting fact the other day when Senator Marty brought up the fact that a Republican senator back in the day proposed that we make sure that these ballots are translated. And that once upon a time in Minnesota, many of the voting practices were translated into Finnish and German and Polish and Russian, because those were the large groups of immigrants here in Minnesota. So I think it's important that we continue that practice. In 2018, more than 11% of Minnesotans spoke a language other than English at home. Districts with high new Minnesotan populations across the states are impacted, not just here in the Twin Cities, but when we look around the state at pockets of immigrants in Rochester to Owatonna, Eden Prairie to Mankato. That is so important that we are meeting the needs of those new voters and allowing and insisting that we provide ballots and information in the languages that they can understand so that they can participate best in this democracy. I'd like to share a quote from Saharo Abdo Ali, one of our Muslim community leaders. He said, "The lack of language resources leaves people feeling like no one cares about them and disincentivize them to the vote. We had to work hard to convince these people that their voices matter, that it's their right as American citizen, even if they don't have the expert knowledge of language." Yet when we showed up to polling locations, the resources were not available to guide them through the process. And we as community members and volunteers can't be everywhere at once. We need to have language resources available to help our voters feel confident and proud of casting their ballot. Voting should be as comfortable and as welcoming experience for everyone. This bill does not allow for that. This is not a welcoming bill. It does not expand the ability and the resources for all Minnesotans to participate in voting. And so with that, I ask members to vote red on this bill. Thank you.
Final discussion on Senate File 173, Senator Frentz, followed by Senator Klein. Senator Frentz.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you, members. This is a pretty fundamental discussion. How easy is it to vote in Minnesota right now? It's pretty easy. How do you know? Because we lead the nation in voter turnout. We should not do things that make it harder to vote. This bill makes it harder for Minnesotans to vote. We should not do things that make it harder to vote. People want to vote. To Senator Putnam's point, what's the actual effect of the bill? As a member of this chamber from Greater Minnesota, I got a pretty good idea that one of the effects of this bill is it's going to make it harder for Greater Minnesotan senior citizens to vote. It's going to make it harder for Minnesotans with disabilities to vote. If we look at the requirement of voter ID, it's going to fall on some Minnesotans, and I would suggest to you members that senior citizens, people with disabilities, which make up a greater percentage in Greater Minnesota than they do at the state as a whole, are going to be disproportionately affected. But don't just take my word for it. The portion of Senate File 173, which comes from Senate File 514, the provisional voting, has from Senator Port on your desks, Olmsted County, just another great southern Minnesota county. And what do they say in point 4 about the provisions of Senate File 173 that come from Senate File 514? Quote, "This will create quite a bit of confusion." have some experience with my grandma and grandpa when they would get mad, and sometimes I thought they were confused, but let me tell you, they were still mad just the same. The letter goes on to say, most likely hard feelings and upset registered voters. Those upset and registered voters are likely to look to the state legislature and say, in a state with 3 million people voting that's going so well and we're leading the country, why would we make it harder for people to vote? And I think we'll hear from those voters if we make a change like this. Members, let's not make it harder to vote. Let's continue on the path to expand voting. Let's make more voices heard. Part of the reason Minnesota has been so successful is that we hear from so many voices. And we don't want upset registered voters. We want happy voters who come out of there with a little sticker and say, I voted. Everybody celebrates. And with that, Mr. President, I'd ask members to vote no on Senate File 173. Thank you.
Final discussion on the bill. Senator Klein, followed by Senator Chamberlain. Senator Klein.
Well, thank you, Mr. President. So the biggest problem, the greatest difficulty with this bill is that we do have a problem with voter confidence in this country, and it is not addressed by this bill. The problem underlying voter confidence, the problem that generated the emails to Senator Newman's inbox, was the perpetuation of the idea that President Trump, former President Trump, won the last election in the face of all contrary evidence. It was advanced by media, it was advanced by elected officials, and it continues to this day, and it's not true. And the fact that it keeps on being said undermines people's belief in our electoral integrity. Passing this bill will do nothing to backtrack on that falsehood and to get us back to truth. Mr. President, just to review the actual numbers, Joe Biden won 81.2 million votes in the last election. Donald Trump won 74.2 million votes. The electors were 306 for Joe Biden, 232 for President Trump. In Georgia, in December of 2020, the Republican Secretary of State, Brad Raffensperger, said, quote, "We now have counted legally cast ballots 3 times, and the results remain unchanged. The numbers don't lie." And that was after a hand recount in that state. In Arizona today, a private contractor called Cyber Ninjas, whose chief executive officer supports baseless claims that the election was stolen, is performing a hand recount of 2.1 million ballots in Maricopa County. Commenting on this recount, the Republican Washington Secretary of State said, "This is politicizing an administrative process with no rules in place to guard how it goes." We cannot forget that 142 congresspeople on January 6 voted to decertify the electoral count in this nation after that election. 147 congresspeople voted against the opinion of American voters, including our own Representatives Fischbach and Hagedorn. That's the big lie. That's the big lie that led to the first ever invasion of our Capitol building since the War of 1812. And it's the lie that all sober and responsible legislators in this chamber and every chamber should be working to dismantle, to restore faith in the integrity of our elections, not to advance the idea that there is a problem with electoral integrity or voter integrity. And with that, I would ask the author of the bill to yield.
Senator Newman, would you yield for a question? Senator Newman will yield. Senator Klein.
Thank you, Senator Newman and Mr. President. Senator Newman, are you willing to join me in declaring here on the Senate floor that Joe Biden won the last election in a fair and secure election and move us forward in dismantling this distrust in the electoral system?
Senator Klein, can you please repeat the question?
Certainly, Mr. President. Senator Newman, are you willing to join me in the Senate floor in declaring that Joe Biden won the previous election in November of 2020 in a fair and secure election and step forward in dismantling the distrust in our electoral system?
Senator Newman.
Mr. President, Senator, no, I do not agree with that. And in point of fact, I'll answer your question in this manner. The election involving Joe Biden and Donald Trump have absolutely nothing to do with me bringing this bill forward at this time. I categorically deny the assertion that this bill is on the Senate floor because of the Trump-Biden election. And I would remind the body that I first brought this bill to the Senate floor in 2012. I then again filed the bill last year, and we got hit with COVID, and I couldn't come forward with the bill last year. I reintroduced the same bill again in 2021, and I am moving forward with it because I believe it's the right thing to do. I acknowledge that there is strong disagreement among some of my fellow senators. But I'm doing it because I think it's the right thing to do. I believe in it. And I, again, categorically deny this has anything whatsoever to do with Trump or Biden.
Final discussion on Senate File 173. Senator Klein.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Senator Newman, for the answer. And I absolutely do not dispute your motives in bringing the bill forward. I guess the only point that I'm making in my opportunity on the floor is that it fails to address the true cause of distrust and electoral integrity in our state, which unfortunately does relate very closely to falsehoods perpetuated around the election of Donald Trump and Joe Biden. Thank you, Mr. President.
Final discussion on the bill. Senator Chamberlain, followed by Senator Marty. Senator Chamberlain.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, members. Look, it's simple concept here. As Senator Newman pointed out, this idea has been around for quite some time, 2012 and last year before COVID. It's a simple idea. We want all eligible voters to be able to vote, and we want their votes to count. All eligible voters to be able to vote, we want their votes to count. This bill does that. It makes it easier for same-day voting and registration in ballots through provisional ballots. It won't turn anybody away at the polls. It pays for people to get the IDs. It will help reimburse for documents. If you don't have the documents, you just sign an affidavit and you get in. So, members, this makes it easier for more people to vote and that they will have their vote count. It's simple, it's common sense, it's supported by 75% of Americans, 69% of Minnesotans support this idea because it's common sense and it's easy. There's a handout in your desk that people tend to gloss over. You need an ID, and once again, at the airport, to go to the DMV, to buy cigarettes, to buy alcohol, cashing checks, getting a tattoo, union elections, body piercing. You need a photo ID for virtually every other transaction that takes place in your life. A voter ID for almost everything, an ID for almost everything. So it's not, this is just common sense, simple stuff to get more people to vote and then have their vote count. If they can't afford it, we'll pay for it. We'll go out and we'll help them get the ID. And then if they don't have documents and the new immigrants and they're eligible to vote, then we will help them get those documents, or they can sign an affidavit. Then they can still vote. So members, this is common sense. It's easy. It makes it easier for everybody to vote, and then, more importantly, to have their vote count. So no other motive or anything for this. Simple common sense supported by the vast majority of Minnesotans and Americans. Thank you, Mr. President.
Final discussion on the bill. Senator Marty, followed by Senator Swazinski. Senator Marty.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the costs to local government or the state. In Finance Committee, the Republican majority was arguing that these costs are overstated. They're very significant. Today we're shifting it so that the local health departments, others who give out the birth certificates that people need will get reimbursed at the end of the year. There are lots of costs to local governments. I'm not going to focus on that. But I also want to point out, and the sheet that Senator Newman handed out with the black on it saying all the things you need a valid ID for. At least one of the members of the Finance Committee said, you know, everybody ought to have an ID. Everybody ought to have a government-issued ID. That's strange language coming from Republicans these days, that they want everybody to have an ID, a government-issued ID card, but okay. And they point out, well, everybody ought to have one. We want to bring them into the economy so they can get bank accounts and everything else. And we're going to help them. We're going to give them these free ID cards. If you look at page 8, line 19 of the bill, these voter IDs that they've now gotten for free after they go through boatloads of efforts to get one, it's not valid for any other purpose. You can't use it in a pharmacy or Social Security office or pawn shop or jail or court or military base or casino or getting a job or anything else. It's not valid. It's only for one purpose. Senator Chamberlain points out it's free, but it's free once you get it. And my question, and I have a number of questions for Senator Newman, if he would yield.
Senator Newman will yield. Senator Marty.
Senator Newman, could you tell me how a homeless person can get a voter ID with their current address on it under your process?
Senator Newman.
Mr. President, Senator Marty, I don't perceive that a homeless person would or should be treated any differently than any other eligible voter in the state of Minnesota. However, having said that, if we have truly a homeless person who does not have a residency and unable to prove that portion of the voter ID requirement, that homeless person need only sign an affidavit stating that he is unable to come up with the necessary documents in order to make him eligible to vote, and at that point, the election judges are required to allow that homeless person the right to vote, and his vote would be counted.
Senator Marty.
And Mr. President, if under current law, if I'm a homeless person and I go to vote, I have to sign an affidavit that I am 18, that I'm a citizen, that I live in the precinct, that certain other things, they have to sign an affidavit now. So in effect, you're saying that person does not need a photo ID.
Senator Marty, are you asking Senator Newman to yield?
Mr. President, I have a number of questions for Senator Newman, if he'll yield.
Well, yep, and then just ask each time, Senator Marty, and then that way he's ready for the question. Senator Newman will yield. Did you catch the question, Senator Newman?
Under the bill, Mr. President, Senator Marty, a homeless person would not be treated any differently than any other voter in the state of Minnesota that is eligible to vote. The homeless person would be required to produce a valid government-issued identification card showing, giving a picture and his residency. Thereafter, if he doesn't have that, that homeless person would be allowed to cast a provisional ballot. And the homeless person then would have the right to come back to either the city clerk or the auditor within 7 days and affirm under oath by way of an affidavit that they can't come up with the necessary documents. At that point, the individual homeless person's vote would be cast and counted. The homeless person would not be treated any differently than any other voter in the state of Minnesota. There isn't a special classification for homeless persons. They are, assuming they are adults, they have every right that any other person who wants to vote in the state of Minnesota. They also have the same responsibility of any other voter in the state of Minnesota.
Senator Marty.
And Mr. President, I do know a number of veterans who went through horrific things in war who have been homeless. And yes, they could, instead of signing the affidavit at the polling place, they can vote a provisional ballot, and as you point out, they can go to the auditor then within the next week and swear another oath and saying, again, this time I couldn't get the ID and so on, and I am who I say I am, and I'm eligible to vote and everything else. And I think the reality is not many of them are going to be able to vote with this, people who served our country, and there may not be that many of them as a percentage, but it's real people. People who I think most of us think ought to be able to vote. They served their country, they went through hell for us. Maybe they ought to vote. But let's take somebody else. Supposing that one of us, supposing I lose my driver's license the week before the election, and I don't know because I had it there last week. I don't know, maybe none of you have ever done that before, but I've had times where I couldn't find my driver's license. It's always in my wallet, but I took it out for something, and usually to fill out some form somewhere where you needed the driver's license number and forgot to put it back, and then I got to go find it. But supposing I pull out my wallet at the polling place and I don't have my driver's license in it, then I can cast a provisional ballot, and then what do I do next? And so, Mr. President, Senator Newman, would you yield to tell me what process I go through to get my new driver's license so I can make my provisional ballot work in that week?
Senator Newman will yield. I'm not sure that he caught the question. Senator Marty, can you please repeat the question?
Mr. President, Senator Newman, if I lose my driver's license and I don't find out that it's missing until Election Day when I'm trying to present it, so I am then allowed to cast a provisional ballot, and I go home and look for it and can't find it anywhere, what do I have to do in that next week in order to vote?
Senator Newman.
Mr. President, Senator Marty, if anyone in the state of Minnesota either loses their driver's license or their driver's license expires or the Minnesota ID expires or they lose it, they have to go through the provisional balloting process, and they would be allowed to cast that vote. If within the 7 days they cannot come up with the duplicate driver's license, which frankly I kind of highly doubt, because remember that a receipt for the application for the duplicate driver's license qualifies under this bill as a document. But if for some reason they simply cannot come up with the necessary documents within those 4 pages of documents that I've outlined in Section 13, if they absolutely cannot come up with the necessary documents, they go to the city clerk, they go to the auditor and say, I have tried, I can't, I lost my driver's license. I can't come up with the information. They are allowed to sign an affidavit to that effect, and their vote counts.
Senator Marty?
Mr. President, thank you. So in other words, if I, a homeless person, lose my license, I can vote provisionally, but my vote doesn't count unless in the next week I go out and sometime, and I don't know, last year may have been different for me, but it was a really, really hectic week, the week after the election. And I didn't have a lot of spare time, and not everybody does, and not everybody has good transportation. Not everybody has a car, not everybody has a driver's license. But for those who have a non-driver ID or a driver's license and they lose it and they do it, yes. So I could go out and find the time in that week and apply for the form. If for some reason or another I can't, then I can go on the 7th day after, and I can swear an oath that I would have sworn on Election Day under current law and do it somewhere else, and then my vote will count. And so I suppose technically neither of those violates your statement that absolutely no one is prevented from voting by this bill. Not in the real world. In theory, that's true, but not in the real world. But then let me ask another question. Mr. President, will Senator Newman yield?
Senator Newman will yield. Senator Marty.
Mr. President, now supposing I'm in a nursing home And I wasn't in a nursing home 2 years ago, but I am now. I haven't driven for several years because I was quite elderly and not in good shape for driving, so I don't really have a driver's license, and I didn't really bother to get a photo ID. But now I'm in the nursing home, and I want to vote. Mr. President, right now, the people come in to help me vote on Election Day. How do I vote under this provision? How do I get my ballot, not just a provisional ballot, but how do I get my ballot counted? How do I get an ID?
Senator Newman.
Mr. President, Senator Marty. Individuals living in a nursing home facility, first of all, I seriously doubt that anyone in a nursing home facility has no identification documents available to them, either current or expired. I would hazard a guess that if someone is in a nursing home facility, just the sheer cost of nursing home facilities in this day and age are such that they are probably already receiving some type of assistance from the government for the nursing home. And it's axiomatic that those individuals are going to have a document, at least expired documents, in conjunction with a certification from the administrator of the nursing home or any of the many documents listed in Section 13 that would allow that individual to vote. Under the extremely unusual circumstances, and I honestly can't imagine this happening, under the extremely unusual circumstances where an individual occupying or living in a nursing home facility has no identification documents whatsoever, that individual can sign an affidavit to that effect. They can cast their vote and their vote counts.
Senator Marty.
Mr. President, so in that case, they don't have to go to the county auditor or the city clerk. They can do their affidavit at the assisted living facility or the nursing home. Mr. President, I'm asking if Senator Newman would yield again to
Senator
make.
Newman,
I want
will
to
yield for a
understand
question?
because I really don't understand how he's doing this.
He will yield. Senator Marty.
So, Senator Newman, if I am in a nursing home and don't have the proper documentation, and I end up doing your affidavit, I don't have to do it in the county clerk's office or the county auditor's office or city clerk's office. Is that correct?
Senator Newman.
Mr. President, Senator Marty, so long as you are not an in-person voter, the answer to your question is correct. The answer is yes.
So,
Senator Marty.
So, Mr. President, your suggestion for others who are in a really tough bind and they don't have the legitimate valid IDs, because yours require the valid ID to have your current address. And, you know, when I look at this chart, there's a huge difference with this. First of all, when you go to the airport, they don't look to see where you live. They just want to see your picture and make sure it's you. They don't require the current address or anything. The hospital, I really don't remember. I've been in the hospital that many times. I don't remember asking for driver's license. They want the insurance card. They really care about that, but I haven't seen that. And all these things, people can cash checks and buy alcohol and buy cigarettes and so on, even if they got out-of-state driver's licenses, even expired out-of-state driver's licenses, none of which shows your current address. So, Senator Newman, I will give you that, in theory, your legislation is not preventing anyone from voting. In reality, it's preventing thousands of people from doing it. The idea somebody who's lost their driver's license is going to be able to go to get a new one or try and get a new one because they have to for their affidavit, try and get a new one, then try and get to the county courthouse or something in the next week. Yeah, some people will. I know a whole lot of people who care very deeply about their right to vote who just, I didn't have time. Spouse is sick. Kids are in trouble with something, with daycare problems or something else. I didn't have time. So we're saying we'll put these burdens up, and maybe it's not going to be an absolutely impossible one. If you gave somebody enough time and money, then they would be able to vote. That sounds worse than some of the, or as bad as, I shouldn't say worse than, some of the Jim Crow laws that Senator Putnam mentioned earlier, where they require to recite the Constitution from memory or something like that. Because it's not real. In the real world, people don't do that. So I want to close by quoting a former small local newspaper editor who died a few years ago, who wrote about this when you put your thing on the ballot 10 years ago that failed. He wrote, "The voter ID amendment, while it does not prevent all low-income, minority, and senior citizens from voting, is part of a well-funded national effort to reduce the number of low-income, minority, and senior citizens voting in future elections. As an average Joe or Jane who simply wants to ensure election integrity, you probably don't want to keep those people from voting. If you vote for this amendment, or in this case this bill, however, you are actively assisting those who do. You'll have to own that. If you can look in the mirror and say, I understand this will discourage thousands of law-abiding Minnesotans from voting, but if it keeps some imposter somewhere from casting a ballot, I'm for it, then this amendment is for you. If your conscience has a hard time with that, vote no." Kerry Ashmore, the editor who wrote that, was a smart person because he got the gist of what we're talking about. Yeah, maybe, again, this is a solution in search of a problem, not a problem with concern about election integrity. The only thing this does is make sure somebody's not impersonating somebody else. Don't just check with our Secretary of State, we check with any Democratic or Republican Secretary of State around the country. Were there more than one of those in the last election? Were there one of them? So you might, in theory, by this legislation, stop one or two people from voting, but you are going to, in reality, by putting up such heavy burdens, you're going to deny thousands and thousands of people, primarily low-income people and seniors, and people who are transient and move a lot. I know a whole lot of us who don't have current driver's license. I'm not speaking for myself now, but I know plenty of people who do. The law says you have to, in 6 weeks or 6 months or something, get a new one when you move, but nobody does that. Not everybody. I know a lot of people who don't. But whether you know anybody who's ever been homeless, or you know anybody who's ever been in a assisted living or nursing home facility, people who frankly don't buy a lot of alcohol and cigarettes and write checks and use credit cards or buy guns or get tattoos or get body piercings. Those folks don't do a lot of that. And those are the folks we're going to disenfranchise. You're right. In theory, they could find a way to vote, but in reality, they won't. So I urge you to take Mr. Ashmore's advice and vote no.
Final discussion on the bill. Senator Swazinski, followed by Senator Rest. Senator Swazinski.
Thank you, Mr. President. Before I begin my remarks, I want to remind my colleague from St. Cloud who had said earlier that he didn't mean to bore us with history. I can't imagine anybody in this chamber ever being bored with a little history lesson, so thank you for that. I rise in opposition. I just want to say I believe with every bone in my body that's my colleague from Hutchinson believes that in voter integrity. I believe his heart is just. And yet, because Minnesotans have a reasonable expectation that all votes that are given are legal and legitimate. That is why we take an oath. That is why if we lie under oath, we're committing a felony. The reason I believe that voter IDs create an undue burden for so many of us, seniors, minorities, students, low-income people, people with disabilities, is because I was that person at one point in my life. In 1978, I was 19 years old, and I was living at the YMCA in downtown Minneapolis. And the village people were singing about how much fun they were having at the Y, and I'm looking around going, where are all these people having fun? Because it was horrible. Nothing was good about living at the YMCA in the late 70s. And every single document in this bill, I didn't possess. I didn't have a driver's license. I had just moved here from Wisconsin. I didn't have a residency requirement. And the election was coming up in November, and I was bummed out because I wasn't going to be able to vote in my second election. And then I found out from a guy I had just recently befriended that in Minnesota, I can vouch for you at the polls, and you can vote. And I'm like, you mean I don't need any evidence? You can just vouch for me that I am who I am? And he said, yeah. And I thought to myself, wow, Minnesota, you got it right. I'm looking at this document that talks about all the things you need a photo ID for. Fishing license is not on the list. I thought that was interesting. You need a photo ID to cash a check. You need a photo ID to order an adult beverage. As I said, you need a photo ID for a fishing license. But none of the things in this document are in the Constitution. The Constitution enshrines for us the right to vote. The 15th Amendment, the 19th Amendment, the 23rd Amendment. In the 1950s, the residents of Washington, D.C., could not cast a ballot for President of the United States. That's unheard of to us today. The 26th Amendment, all those amendments expanded the right to vote because we believed it to be the right thing to do. I've heard the words today about voting should be comfortable. It should be welcoming. The first time I voted in Minnesota, the voter turnout was 57.9%. In 2020, it was 79.96%. We're going to get it to 80. But the reason that number has increased is because we have made it more welcoming. We have made it more comfortable. We celebrate progress. We celebrate progress in technology. We celebrate progress in the economy. We celebrate progress in the environmental movement. Why aren't we celebrating progress in the right to vote? 25 states, since the Crawford Supreme Court decision, have made further restrictions on this wonderful right, the right to vote. In Philadelphia, in the 1700s, we began this experiment. It's the longest ongoing experiment in world history, representative democracy. And that experiment that began in Philadelphia has spread across the continent over the next 200 and some odd years. The Constitution begins with the words, we the people. Yeah, the people that want to be welcomed. The people that want to be welcomed at the polls. We the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union. It's a work in progress. Voting is a work in progress. The Lincoln in his Gettysburg Address, which, by the way, was shorter than my speech, he ends with, government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from the earth. In our fellow chamber over here, above the speaker, it says, Vox Populi, Vox Dei. The voice of the people is the voice of God. We need to be more inclusive, not less inclusive. It is a civic duty to vote, from township elections to presidential elections. Let's not impede the progress we've made in this great American experiment. Thank you, Mr. President.
Final discussion on the bill. Senator Rest, followed by Senator Dibble. Senator Rest.
Thank you, Mr. President and members. A fine point on the the language in the House chamber. A young legislator was once asked, you understand that those words are blasphemy. The voice, it's bad Latin to start with, but anyway, the voice of God is the voice of God. The voice of the people is the voice of the people, and don't mistake the two of them. But today I want to speak about process, the way in which we make law, and the conversations that we have in this chamber among our members as we do that. Voting, we all know and celebrate, is a right, a duty, and a privilege, but mostly a right, which has Senator Chamberlain did, but certainly Senator Newman pointed out, it's not a requirement. The framers left it to the states in the main, and through the amendment process that Senator Swasensky spoke so eloquently about, left it to the states to administer and conduct elections. Occasionally themselves at the federal level passing laws, in particular in the 60s, the Voting Rights Act, to ensure that all who were citizens of a certain age with a couple of other requirements were not going to be denied the opportunity to vote and to register, and maybe not in that particular law, but having established prior to that, they weren't going to have to pay to do it, which was perhaps the most disenfranchising law on the books, particularly in a number of southern states, to keep black people and poor whites from voting. Today in the Star Tribune, Virginia Heffernan, a writer that I'm fond of, talked about the chief problem with democracy is that it takes too long to get to consensus. We talk and we talk and we talk, and we don't reach consensus. We sometimes reach compromises, but there's a big difference between consensus and compromise. Consensus is only a noun. It also has a Latin derivation, a derivative, and it means feeling together, coming together, knowing together. It's only a noun. You can't use the word consensus as a verb. Consensus is a common agreement that's arrived at through understanding interests of the negotiators and not just arguing positions on policy, which in and of themselves frequently lead to failure even when a common good and goal is prized. The other word, compromise, is both a passive verb as well as a noun, and for many it has a negative connotation that somehow, if you reach a compromise, you have abandoned your principles. Minnesotans have already spoken on voter ID. Governor Dayton vetoed Senator Newman's bill, and then the voters spoke for themselves and they rejected it. I've worked on election legislation for many years, sometimes successfully, often not, including ranked choice voting, no excuse absentee voting, as opposed to early voting, national popular vote, moving our primary, and a variety of administrative reforms. In 2010, when in the House, we couldn't reach consensus. And I went over to the House chamber, which I don't do so frequently anymore, and approached Representative Tom Emmer. And I touched him on the shoulder, and he turned around and said, "Who are you?" If you know Tom Emmer, that was pretty typical of him. And I said, "Well, I'm Ann Rest. I'm over in the Senate, and I wonder if during the interim you'd like to talk about changes in our election administration." And he looked at me and he said, "Well, maybe." And that became the start of a conversation between a Democrat and a Republican, where the leadership in the body was also divided, and the governor was a Democrat. And we worked all summer, and we didn't talk to politicians. We talked to election officials out in the fields. We talked with the election judges. What can we do in Minnesota to improve, streamline, make the system fairer? And by the end of that summer and into the fall, Representative Emmer and I, agreed with these election officials, and we put together a bill. We brought it back to the legislature in that following year, and it passed. And we had been told and had a principle of dealing with election law that in order for a governor to accept it, because it could so easily be changed with a difference in the majority parties, that it had to be supported by a bipartisan majority, and it was. Then in 2016, following the precinct caucuses, which were chaotic in both parties, I worked immediately with a Republican, Representative Sanders. Kurt Doubt was the Speaker of the House, to change Minnesota into a presidential primary state. Co-authors in the Senate were both David Hann and Tom Bach, and in the House for Representative Sanders, he was an assistant majority leader. One of his co-authors was now Speaker Melissa Hortman. The Republican Party, the Democratic Party, both publicly supported that legislation. It was not unanimous. There were members in both parties and in both houses that either thought it went too far, or it didn't do this, or it didn't do that. But the consensus that those of us that were making the case was adopted, and we successfully conducted a presidential primary in 2020, and I believe that it is going to stay in place. So what's the point of those two stories? The point is we need to listen to one another more. We need to listen to people outside of this chamber and not come to the chamber with bills that have a preconceived, anointed conclusion that somehow only one group of ideas, only one group of people know what's best. So I challenge us, I'm going to be voting no, but I challenge us to return to a process of working together, to return to a process of attempting to reach consensus, and to pay attention to the people of Minnesota who have already spoken on such an important issue in our democracy. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
Final discussion on the bill, Senator Dibble, followed by Senator Johnson Stewart. Senator Dibble.
Thank you, Mr. President, members. It's been said previously, it bears repeating because it's so absolutely true. This bill in front of us that we've now discussed for some period of time is a solution in search of a problem. In fact, creates a whole bunch of problems, and totally unnecessarily so. Voter ID laws deprive voters of their rights. That's an objective fact that has been measured time and time again in state after state. It reduces participation and is in direct opposition to our democratic values and ideals of greater participation in our democracy by the people, of whom every single one is equal in the eyes of the law. Fundamentally interferes in the American democratic process. And it's been shown in study after study with objective, irrefutable proof that these kinds of laws reduce voter participation by 2 to 3 percentage points. Members, Mr. President, that represents tens of thousands of votes that either don't get cast or don't get counted, which of course affects electoral outcomes, but more troubling is it fundamentally interferes with basic foundational individual freedoms and rights for everyone to fully and freely and fairly participate in our democracy. And members, what about democracy is so important? I hesitate to wade into these waters because, of course, we had the most amazing civics teacher and government teacher in the world speak before me, Steve Swedzinski, but I will venture forth. But first I want to say, Senator Newman did say earlier, Mr. President, that there was a lack of confidence in our elections, in our democracy, and Senator Klein and Senator Port pointed out, yeah, that may be true, but that's true because they've been told a bunch of lies this last couple of years. So I wish we were spending this morning talking about the amazing electoral and democratic system we have in place here in Minnesota. It's mighty and it's awesome. And it didn't come about by mistake. It came about because this legislature as an institution, not this legislature, but the Minnesota legislature has put together an incredible electoral system that allows for better and more access by more people. We have a civic tradition of participation. We've cleared out a lot of the friction and static and barriers that prevent people's access to exercise that democratic franchise of theirs. And I wish we were talking about those things and celebrating them, because we should be really, really proud and really, really excited about that, not diminishing that, as this legislation does and as this debate does. We have the best system in the country. And in our democracy, our vote is our voice. Your vote is your voice. And in no other system of government do you create the same kind of legitimacy of governance, because it's a rule by the people, of the people, for the people. And it creates a level of transparency and accountability like no other that we've ever had or that we have anywhere in the world. So better decision-making occurs. Better and more proper functioning of government, always in need of improvement. That's why we have this chamber and this body to discuss the problems and the shortcomings and the shortfalls, and we invite the public and the citizens in to participate with us in that problem solving. But in the end, it's the only system that delivers the kinds of laws and rules and oversight and governance that are developed primarily with the interests of the people and the public good in mind. It's this kind of system that delivers more and more economic prosperity and more sustained economic prosperity. We are on a journey to achieve those ideals, but in a system of democracy fueled by direct vote of representatives, we have a better chance of achieving that ideal and that aspiration than in any other. And it's a system where we're governed by the rule of law and not through favoritism or patronage or family association. Every single person, despite the circumstances of their birth, is equal. And that is most tangibly and literally manifest in your ability and your right to vote. And this bill diminishes that right and diminishes our democracy as a consequence. It's founded in the ideas of freedom and of liberty and a fairness of access to opportunity. And this discussion, of course, doesn't come without a cost. Whether you believe Senator Newman that this is going to be practically free, but it's still going to cost some money, or you believe Senator Port, there's going to be an ongoing $8 million cost year over year, that's money. That's resource that could be spent to meet the needs of the people that are crying out to have that freedom and fairness of opportunity. I wish we were talking about and learning about and spending the time and the political capital learning about, for example, youth homelessness in Minnesota. On any given night in Minnesota, 6,000 young people disconnected, separated from their families, are homeless or experiencing homelessness or are at risk of homelessness. You don't see them under freeway bridges necessarily or in the parks. But what are they doing? They're sleeping on sofas. They're using their bodies to obtain food and what they need. They're crowding into apartments with each other. They're separated from their community. They're separated from their families. They're not getting an education. They don't have access to health care. They don't have access to mental health services. They either come from a background of familial rejection because they're LGBTQ, or they have other dysfunction in their community or their family. They're coming out of sexual and physical abuse, and as a consequence of experiencing homelessness, are subjected to sexual and physical assault, sex trafficking. 50% of homeless youth are experiencing serious mental health challenges. 36% have chronic physical health problems. We don't have a mental health continuum that even begins to respond to their needs. We could devote that $8 million per year to serving those young people, and we could get rid of the fact that 6,000 young people are homeless tonight. We could be spending the whole morning learning about the reality, the lived experience of Minnesota citizens who aren't fully participating in this system of governance and in this democracy. We could be devoting those resources to that, but we're not. We're creating a contrived set of issues and problems, and we're wasting time and wasting money on a problem that doesn't exist, and diminishing our democracy, diminishing ourselves, diminishing this institution as a consequence. Members, please vote red. Thank you.
Final discussion on the bill. Senator Johnson Stewart, followed by Senator Bigham. Senator Johnson Stewart.
Thank you, Mr. President. Senator Newman clearly stated his motivation for proposing this bill in 2021. Clearly stated it in his press release, stating millions of American citizens believe there was widespread fraud during the last election, and their loss of faith in the integrity of our election system alone justifies incorporating photo ID into our voting system. We must use every tool at our disposal to eliminate all irregularities, inconsistency, and fraud. In addition, We must restore faith in our election system for those voters who no longer believe our system is secure. A voter ID rule promises that every single Minnesotan who wants to participate in the process will be counted and protected, no more, no less, end quote. I rise to dispute this, and in fact, I rise to state the truth behind who this vote or who this bill really disenfranchises. My father was a proud voter. He never missed an election. He died in 2016 after suffering Parkinson's disease for 30 years. My dad was a very proud voter. He was a football player. He was very large, but Parkinson's disease ravaged his body. My dad was also a driver's ed teacher, and one of the hardest things that we did as a family was convince my dad that he really couldn't drive anymore. So for the last decade of his life, sadly, he had an expired driver's license. In fact, when my dad died in 2016, every one of his documents that would prove who he was expired or lost. He was born in 1937. I did all of the clean out of all the documents because I was the executor of their estate. I never found his Social Security card. I never found my mother's Social Security card when she died in 2018. The only birth certificate I ever found of my dad's was a framed, pretty painted one with angels on it, which certainly was not a valid form of ID. Their passports were expired as well. My dad never missed an election. And praise the Lord, he died in February of 2016 because early on he was wondering what he was going to do. How could he vote if he had an expired driver's license? Now, this law doesn't apply to my dad because he's been gone now for 5 years. But I think about families like mine. My dad had 5 working, capable, financially secure children and a wife who supported him. And I think about the work it would have taken to get my dad to the Social Security office, to get him a new Social Security card, or to get him to the county seat to get whatever, to request a birth certificate from when he was born in 1937. We could barely get my dad out of the house. He was big and he was totally immobile, but his brain was there and he was 100% intellectually capable of voting and talking about elections. Have you ever been to the Social Security office in Minneapolis? I have. A couple years ago, my daughter needed a passport to do a study abroad, and we couldn't find her Social Security card. I don't know. I don't have mine. Well, actually, I do, because after that horrific experience, I got a new one of mine. We went down to the Social Security Administration on, I don't know, it's on Nicollet or something, and we waited for 3 hours to get a Social Security card. Now, I am gainfully employed. I took my daughter with me, and we sat there and got it. I wonder how people who work at minimum wage, or who are unemployed, or who don't have a car, or who fill in the blank, any other hardship, get a Social Security card. Because I had to do that again when it was my turn to replace my card. It is incredibly difficult to get a Social Security card. And the reason we were getting it was because we needed a passport, which is also very difficult. You have to make an appointment at the post office and show up in a 1-hour period in the middle of the day. Again, if I was not gainfully employed and my own boss, I'd have to take time off work and get myself there. Oh, but wait, she also needed a certified copy of her birth certificate, which meant that ahead of time I had to, luckily I could do it online because I have a computer. I could go online, I could print all the documents, I could send it in, certified mail, again, another cost, with my money, and I was smart. I got 2 copies because I thought, I'm never doing this again. I got 2 copies, 2 for my first daughter, 2 for my second daughter, 2 for me, and I put them in the safe. Getting documentation of who you are is incredibly difficult. I've lived it. And my daughters are in their 20s. Can you imagine an elderly man who maybe was born in England and now he needs to get a copy of his birth certificate? All I had to do was go online. Okay, my parents were educated, smart people. They had master's degrees. And Till their dying day, I tried to show them how to do things online. They could never figure it out. And that is only about my parents, but again, I'm standing up for my parents, who luckily don't have to deal with this. Now, Senator Chamberlain so eloquently indicated that according to this list, there's so many other things that you need ID for. I'm looking at this, and it's kind of funny. You know, my dad wasn't really into pawn shops. He didn't go to jail. He never adopted a baby. He gave up piercings and tattoos decades ago, so that wasn't really needed by him. Actually, my dad didn't have any piercings. But some of these are hilarious. My dad bought plenty of alcohol, but in the last 10 years of his life, he couldn't leave his house. He didn't buy alcohol. Somebody bought it for him. He didn't smoke. He didn't donate blood. He received his care at Mayo, and every time we went, he never showed his ID. They knew who he was. So this is a hardship. This is a hardship, and to quote a former Senate leader who unfortunately is not here today, but his words were quoted in the Duluth Tribune when this bill was argued in 2012, Senator Bach himself says, this bill is not about election integrity, it's about throwing up roadblocks to the ballot box. This bill will keep seniors from voting. My parents included, this would have been a huge hardship for them. It will keep students and young people from voting. My daughters are a perfect example of that. It will keep low-income Minnesotans from voting, and Senator Marty eloquently indicated that it all sounds very easy to sign the affidavit, but even I was confused, and I have a master's degree in engineering. What? I have to go back 7 days? Well, what if I can't get back? What do I have to do? I was here with Lindsay saying, can you explain it to me a little bit further? It is incredibly confusing, it is intimidating, and I agree with Senator Marty that we're not going to see the follow-up. This is a solution in search of a problem. This will keep law-abiding. Oh, again, I'm still quoting Senator Bach, by the way. This will keep law-abiding, perfectly eligible voters from being able to cast a ballot on Election Day, and even now, 9 years later, it will still cost us millions of dollars to implement. I am voting no, and I encourage all of you in the chamber, which is most of my colleagues on the DFL side, to vote no as well. Thank you.
Final discussion on Senate File 173, Senator Bingham, followed by Senator Murphy. Senator Bingham.
Thank you, Mr. President. Would Chairman Newman yield for a question?
Senator Bingham, Senator Newman, will you yield? Yep, I'll tell her. He will yield. Can you, it's very hard to hear you.
Sorry.
Senator Bingham.
I don't think I've ever been told I've been too quiet before, Mr. President, so thank you for that. First today. Senator Newman, as I understand the bill, a person would go in to vote and then, like, for whatever reason, maybe they're registering for the first time, maybe they don't have proper ID, their ballot would then go into a provisional section or pile, and then they have 7 days to come back in to prove they are who they say they are. Is that accurate?
Senator Newman.
Mr. President and Senator Bingham, there is a period of 7 days in which a voter who has cast a provisional ballot can go to the city clerk or to the auditor with the documents necessary to prove residency and identification. If after, or I should say within that 7 days, they are unable to come up with those necessary documents, they are able to sign an affidavit saying they have attempted to find those documents, have been unable to do so, and their vote, their provisional ballot then counts.
Senator Bingham.
Thank you. Would Senator Newman yield for one more question?
Senator Newman will yield. Senator Bingham.
Senator Newman, it is state law that employers have to allow employees off to go vote. Is there any provision in this bill that requires employers to accommodate the provisional ballot portion of your legislation? Meaning, does an employer have to allow an employee time off of work to go deal with their provisional ballot?
Senator Newman.
Mr. President, Senator Bingham, there is no specific provision in the bill on the issue that you have raised. However, there is, as you have stated, a law that requires employers to allow time off, and I'm going to make an assumption that that law would be applicable to the provisional visit to the city clerk or to the auditor, but I cannot say for certain. But it would certainly be the intent, the legislative intent, to require employers to allow folks to go to the auditor or the city clerk for the purposes of producing the necessary documents.
Senator Bigham.
Thank you, Mr. President, and I appreciate that, Senator Newman. I'm going to just say this, that that's kind of the definition of suppression, is you are enfranchising and suppressing somebody from being able to go and exercise their right to vote, because there is no guarantee in that they are going to be able to do this during the time that's allotted by this piece of legislation that has no chance of being signed into law. The other thing I would say is when you're looking at how elections are administered, there's canvassing. This bill doesn't match up with local elections and canvassing issues that weren't even touched during this debate, and I'm not going to start that right now. But members, this will add a level of difficulty to elections, to people exercising their constitutional right to participate in our democracy and to have their voice heard, which is what we do every time we exercise our right to vote and to fill out a ballot. So I would encourage members to vote no.
Final discussion on the bill. Senator Murphy.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you, members. I am glad to see there are more members in the chamber. For a bit of time, there were just 4 of our GOP colleagues, and this is an important issue and one that is due our discussion, and it's important that we're listening to each other. One point of correction for the record, Senator Newman has mentioned a couple of times that you are required to use a photo ID to vote in a union election. And that might be the case for some unions, but it is certainly not a requirement at all. And those unions, democratically elected, get to make that choice for themselves. So I just want to make sure that for the record, that is clear. This weekend in the district I represent, Senate District 64, we had another town hall all throughout this session as we've been holding town halls and coffee gatherings, et cetera, all virtually. We've had a high number of people attending, in part because they can't come and join us here, in part because they are interested, they are engaged, they want to participate. Minnesotans are demanding a say in the work of this session. They're demanding a say in their government, and that is their prerogative. We represent their interests. That's why we're here. That is an honor. It is a responsibility. It is a duty. It is a privilege. And I'm so grateful to be a part of it. Across the country, as a number of people who have already spoken across the country, there are efforts to limit the vote, to suppress the vote. Our country has a violent history in the fight over the right to vote, a violent history in pursuit of suffrage, a violent history in the civil rights movement. We have seen things imposed like a poll tax, rampant gerrymandering by states so elected people can pick their voters and not the other way around. We know of current examples of efforts to purge voter rolls, to make it harder for people who have registered to vote to actually vote because their names have been stricken from the record without their knowledge. We know we have a history of arbitrary civics tests meant to deny people access to the ballot. We have a very difficult and sometimes violent history in our country over the sacred right to vote because it enshrines in the people the power to set our course. And that's why today's discussion is so disturbing. If people are losing faith in the integrity of our elections, it is because of the persistent rhetoric coming from elected officials. And one of our colleagues earlier today, my colleague from Dakota County, asked the author of the bill about a connection between this issue and the 2020 election. And in a press release released when this bill was first heard and introduced and heard by Senator Newman said this, quote, "Millions of American citizens believe that there was widespread fraud during the last election, and their loss of faith in the integrity of our election system alone justifies incorporating photo ID into our voting system. We must use every tool at our disposal to eliminate all irregularities, inconsistencies, and fraud. In addition, we must restore faith in our election system for those voters who no longer believe our system is secure. A voter ID rule promises every single Minnesotan who wants to participate in the process will be counted and protected, no more or no less." There in the press release, a direct connection between the big lie of the 2020 election and this measure. And let's remember that voter ID is in pursuit of those who are impersonating a voter. We have no evidence of voter impersonation in Minnesota. Let us also recall that the persistent rhetoric about voter fraud across this country, driven in part by the former president, led to a violent insurrection in our nation's capital, something we have never seen before. So let us be clear about what we are debating today. This is not a fix-up measure intended to protect the vote. This is the next generation of efforts to limit those who can vote, to limit people who are eligible legally to vote, to suppress the vote. In the other body, they've taken up things like automatic voter registration, second chances in allowing people who served a term and a felony their ability to vote again, campaign finance reform. We're not doing any of that work in this body, none of that work. Instead, provisional balloting and voter ID, two measures that make it harder to vote. And when we think about our history, the history of the ways in which people with authority have used their power to make it harder for people to vote. Poll taxes, civics tests, gerrymandering. We cannot stand in this body and say we're doing everything to expand the franchise when this measure is the next in a generation of efforts to suppress the vote. Senator Newman distributed a number of documents demonstrating the support on the part of voters for photo ID. But the very most important poll was the vote of Minnesotans in 2012, when they resoundingly, with their vote at the ballot box, said no, hell no, to voter ID. And we should be listening to them, because as we know, the voice of the people is the voice of God. It is our job to represent their interests, to represent their voice, and to make sure that our election system, which is the envy of the nation, is available for them to cast their ballots, to set our course, to set our future. This measure attacks that. We must vote no. And I ask you respectfully to vote no. This is a historic moment. This is a historic vote. I will cast a no vote. Thank you, Mr. President.
Final discussion on Senate File 173. Senator Westrom.
Thank you, Mr. President. Members, I rise in support of Senator Newman's bill common sense photo ID for voting. Members, just saying something doesn't make it so, which we've heard a few of the prior speakers say stuff, repeat it, and therefore we're supposed to think it's fact. We've heard one of the prior members several speakers ago from, I think it was the senator from Edina, say that there's no evidence of illegal voting in Minnesota. Really? No evidence. Just go online. I just spent a little time before getting on the floor here reviewing some of this with our staff. Doesn't take long and you can find a history of people even in Minnesota prosecuted under our system that leaks like a sieve, and that's why we're here trying to fix it. Provisional ballots last week, which are common sense. Don't throw questionable ballots in the box before you know for sure they're legitimate. 47 other states have that, not Minnesota. Voter ID speeds up the process, makes it more efficient, makes it easier for the election judges. But we're being told there's no illegitimate voting in Minnesota by the members that we're hearing talk from the DFL.
Mr. President, point of order.
Mr. President?
Hold on,
go ahead.
Senator Putnam, for what reason do you stand?
Oh, thank you, Mr. President. I'm sorry for interrupting, Senator Westrom. I just wanted to clarify very quickly that no one has said that voter irregularities do not occur at any point. The prior speeches mentioned
Senator Putnam, do you have a point of order?
Just a point of clarification.
Okay, this is not the time for a point of clarification. Senator Westrom, please continue.
Mr. President, Senator Putnam, you can talk later if you want to talk about that, but Mr. President, members, to Senator Putnam's point, I sat in our designated rooms just 20, 30 minutes ago and listened to one of the senators from the suburbs say that there's no proof of illegal voting going on in Minnesota. That's a pretty direct quote, if it's not exact. Mr. President, members, just saying it doesn't make it so. You can look up online, and I'll share just a few. In the recent history, there's been members or citizens of Minnesota prosecuted for voter fraud, illegally voting. Mankato, Worthington, St. Cloud, St. Paul, those were just the quick read. If you spend a little more time, you can go through the list of pages and pages on the websites if you want to look it up and really get the facts. This bill, Senator Newman has brought, voter ID, will help make it hard to cheat but easy to vote. If you don't have an ID for all the other reasons we've heard you need it in life, you can get one free from the state of Minnesota. That's very simple, a very straightforward process. About a month ago, I was into our own DMV, helping our daughters get their driver's license for the first time, or qualify for their driver's permit. We had to go through some of those same routines, getting certificates, getting birth certificates, to prove that they were the right age and they were qualified to vote here or drive in the state of Minnesota. That's all this bill is asking. Similar types of qualifications. So when you go in to vote, it's easy, quick for the judge to look at it, make sure you are who you say you are, so you don't have to be prosecuted on that list of illegal voters that have been prosecuted here in the state of Minnesota. So, Mr. President, just to keep time moving along, I do have a question for Senator Bigham, if she could make her way back to the floor as I conclude some of my comments. But members, this is a very straightforward way to streamline and help legitimize and make sure election integrity exists here in Minnesota. And using practical ways to do it, which we use in many other walks of life, for cashing checks, for getting on airplanes, for proving to an officer you are who you are, if they pull you over for speeding, whatever the issue is, IDs are used all the time, and this bill gives free IDs if somebody doesn't have one. We just heard from the senator from the Minnetonka area before, talking about her father who had been disabled with Parkinson's disease. Many of you know I lost my eyesight several years ago in a farm-related accident. When I went in to get the driver's license for our daughters a month ago, I also had to renew my ID. Minnesota, somebody just getting a Minnesota ID that also has a disability, like Senator Johnson Stewart's father, 50 cents. 50 cents to renew the ID or to carry a state ID around. It was a fairly simple process to renew it. I just did it a month ago. We just heard from the senator from St. Paul, Senator Murphy, talking about voter suppression. That's a reason to pass this bill. Voter suppression. We don't want voter suppression. We want it easy to vote, hard to cheat. But members, what the member from St. Paul didn't talk about is the voter suppression that goes on if somebody votes illegally, which I just referenced. There's multiple in Minnesota that have been prosecuted if you want to look it up. And that's in the system we have that's hard to find cheaters. And then if you want to look nationwide, this past election, there's all kinds of evidence of voting irregularities, people not living where they say they live when they voted, voting illegally in another state that they don't even live in, or if they're dead, hundreds and thousands of ballots from dead voters. Can we not agree that dead voters shouldn't be in our counted in our system? Members, you just have to look around, and you can find several examples of these. This evidence was captured in hundreds and over 1,000 affidavits of eyewitnesses this past election. And if that wasn't enough, it was captured on video that people didn't even know was running in security cameras in some of the election halls where they said they shut them down at 11, 12 o'clock at night. But by the way, the security cameras caught people in there 1, 2, 3 in the morning counting ballots when everybody else went home, and they weren't supposed to be there counting ballots. That's video evidence. The same type of evidence that convicted Officer Chauvin because some brave young lady in Minneapolis last summer pulled out her camera and put it on video. And yet members here are saying that same video type evidence shouldn't be counted. Let's just simplify the process, streamline it with practical things like photo ID. And that's what this bill does, and that's why I support it. Mr. President, if Senator Bigham would yield for a couple of questions, or the senator from Dakota.
Senator Bigham will yield. Senator Westrom.
Mr. President, Senator Bigham, you talked about reasons you were concerned voting for this bill, but Senator Klein earlier talked about, can we at least agree on a few things? And I've got two questions for you, Senator Bigham. Can we at least agree, Senator Bigham, that dead people shouldn't be voting in elections?
Senator Bigham.
Mr. President, Senator Westrom, I hope this has a point. Of course, dead people should not be voting in elections.
Senator Westrom.
So, Mr. President, Senator Bigham yield for one more question.
Senator Bigham will yield for another question. Senator Westrom.
Mr. President, Senator Bigham, thanks that we can agree that at least dead people shouldn't be voting. Senator Bigham, can we also just agree that people that don't live in a precinct or an area that they're voting shouldn't be counted in the vote?
Senator Bigham.
Mr. President, Senator Westrom, of course, because that's our law.
Senator Westrom.
And Mr. President, members, thank you, Senator Bigham. And that's the reason we bring this type of common sense bill forward, to help streamline and make sure there's election integrity, and it's easy for election judges to verify people are who they say they are, and they live where they say they live. In conclusion, Mr. President, members, there's one of two things that's correct from what we've heard on the floor. This past Senate hearing, state government, watching it on video, Secretary of State Simons was asked the question by some of the committee members, is there voter fraud in Minnesota? And after a fairly long pause, his response was yes. Then he tried to qualify it to a minuscule extent. Members, that's one of the first times I've heard Secretary Simons finally admit that there is fraud in Minnesota elections. This is a big step in the right direction to snub out that fraud that goes on in Minnesota elections that even Secretary of State Simons admitted this year does exist in Minnesota, which contradicts some of the arguments we've been hearing from the prior members against this bill. So members, you have to decide who's right. The members that said there's no illegal voting in Minnesota, or Secretary of State Simon, who does agree that there's Minnesota fraud in Minnesota elections. That's why I urge your support of this bill. It's time to adopt voter ID. Make it easy to vote, hard to cheat in Minnesota.
Members, just a reminder, Section 121, number 2 of Mason says no person may indulge in personalities, impugn motives of other members, or use indecent or profane language. There was some indecent language, in my opinion, used on the Senate floor a little bit earlier. So just a reminder. Let's see, before we go to the bill's author, I have Senator Klein and Senator Putnam. Senator Klein.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. The previous speaker made a statement that hundreds of thousands of dead people voted in the previous election. I wanted to state for the record that that is not true. There's no evidence for that, and it should not stand unchallenged. We wonder why there is a diminishment in voter trust and faith in elections in this state and in this country, and it is because elected officials make statements just like that one, not backed by evidence. Let's stop saying things like that, or at least bring forward evidence if we have statements like that to make. Thank you, Mr. President.
Final discussion on the bill. Senator Putnam, followed by Senator Newman. Senator Putnam.
Mr. President, I rise to apologize to Senator Westrom for interrupting him. No disrespect was intended. I'm still the new kid. So I apologize, wanted to publicly apologize to Senator Westrom for interrupting him. But I also do want to make another point, and that's the point that I was intending to make before. We all know that elections are imperfect. No one has suggested that they aren't. No one who has spoken today has said that every election has been absolutely perfect and every vote has been counted the way it should be. The argument that I have heard repeatedly when it comes to claims about voter irregularity has been much more precise. And I think when we have good people of good intentions who disagree, as is the case in this body right now, precision is incredibly important. What I have heard said repeatedly is that voter impersonation does not happen. That does not mean that other varieties of voter irregularities don't occur. And the reason why that's significant is that voter ID only solves the problem of voter impersonation. It doesn't solve any of the other problems that Senator Westrom was talking about. The voter ID does not solve the scourge of zombie votes that we might be afraid of right now. It doesn't solve that problem. The only problem that it fixes is the problem of voter impersonation. And that is what many folks here have been saying doesn't occur frequently. So, Mr. President, I just wanted to add that degree of precision to our discussion.
Final discussion on the bill. Senator Newman.
Mr. President, let me begin by thanking my colleagues on both sides of the aisle for our discussion today. It has been emotional. There's a lot of passion. And I think it really reflects how strongly people feel about this issue. If at any time I have, in bringing this bill forward, impugned the integrity or motives of any of my colleagues, I apologize. I never, ever intended that to happen. By the same token, this is a matter that I believe very strongly in. I believe it is the right thing to do for the state of Minnesota and for the voters in the state of Minnesota. And it is for that reason and that reason alone that I have brought this bill to you this morning. We've heard many, many assertions on the floor. And I would remind you that a good deal of them are what I would call glittering generalities, simply broad statements made, but not really backed up with facts. And I would account for that kind of an argument because of the passion and emotion that this topic brings to the floor. We have heard today that this makes voting more difficult for certain people, the elderly, veterans, students. I really want to thank my colleague from Eden Prairie for bringing forward the story of his personal experience with the YMCA. I think that's telling because it's a personal experience that one of our colleagues went through, which he believes under law at that time would have prevented him from voting, but not under this bill. Under this bill, he would have been able to vote because of the provision for the affidavit. With him unable to come forward with the necessary documents under those circumstances that he shared with us, he would have been able to vote. Senator Dibble brought up the fact that the rule of law is really important. And many, many times I agree with Senator Dibble on various issues, and I agree with him on this one. The rule of law is very important. And in this case, with respect to this bill, the United States Supreme Court has ruled that voter ID laws are constitutional if they are drafted correctly. And specifically to many of the comments that we've heard on the floor this morning, that we are making it harder for the elderly to vote and for seniors to vote, for folks who are in nursing homes, for veterans, for students. To all of those arguments, the United Supreme Court addressed those issues in Crawford versus Marion County. And specifically, what the Supreme Court said was, yes, that is an additional burden on those voters. Yes, it is an additional burden. But if the voter ID bill provides for provisional balloting, and if it provides for an affidavit to be signed, if you cannot come up with the necessary documents, if those two things are present, then the additional burden cast on certain classes of people, voters, is acceptable because it protects the integrity of the voting system. And the Supreme Court specifically outlined those who are economically disadvantaged, the disabled, the students, the elderly. They specifically talked about that and said it's okay if you provide them a path so that their vote will in fact count. And that's provisional balloting, and that's the affidavit. And those are facts, folks. That isn't a glittering generality. The final point I want to make on this, and then I'm going to sit down. The right to vote the exercise of our constitutional right to vote is something that people in the state of Minnesota, whether you are a Republican or you are a Democrat or you're an independent, it doesn't matter. People take it really seriously. Really seriously. And I would suggest to you that along with the right to cast that vote comes a certain amount of personal responsibility. Not one person has brought up that issue on the floor today. Personal responsibility. If you want to exercise your right to vote, you have to affirmatively do something in order to vote. You have to proactively get out there and vote. And there is absolutely nothing wrong with that. So I submit to you that along with all of the statements that have been made about the right to vote, there is a common part that goes right along with that, and that is the personal responsibility to get off the couch and go and vote. Thank you, Mr. President.
Final discussion on Senate File 173, Senator Gazelka.
Thank you, Mr. President. Members, think about what you do need to have a driver's license for. First of all, obviously driving. If you want to drive, you have to have a driver's license. If you want to go buy a bottle of wine, you have to have a driver's license, or tobacco. If you're applying for Medicaid or Medicare, you have to have a driver's license. If you want to go hunting or fishing, you have to present a driver's license. Most business transactions, like a bank loan, you have to have a driver's license. If you have to take professional testing for just about anything, you have to have a driver's license. If you're going to apply for college, they want to see your driver's license. When you fill out a work form, you want to work someplace, they're going to ask for your driver's license. VA benefits, show me your driver's license. If you want to get a passport, show me your driver's license. And if you don't have a passport, you're going to travel by plane, show me your driver's license. Now, they do make some accommodations in some of those situations, but so does this bill for voting and presenting your driver's license. And this is not out of the norm, members. There's 36 states, it's been mentioned, 36 states already request or require some form of driver's license to vote. So what is this about? It ensures election integrity. Now, that's all we're asking for. There are accommodations for people in different situations. We'll provide a free driver's license if you need one. And even if you don't have one, there's accommodations to figure out to prove that your vote is valid. But when 36 states have already done it, and we require a driver's license for just about everything, and we'll give a free driver's license to anybody that needs one, members, it isn't the way we're doing it isn't right now in Minnesota. We need to have a driver's license to vote. We need to ensure election integrity. And I will say that this is the voice of the people. The voice of the people want us to pass a driver's license to vote. You have to have a photo ID to vote. It's something like as much as 75% of the public, when you ask them, does it make sense to have a photo ID presented to vote, as high as 75% would say, members, that this is good to ensure election integrity. So, members, this is a green vote. Thank you.
Members, we're on final passage of Senate File 173. Seeing no further discussion, the Secretary will take the roll. Members in rooms 303, 206, and the President's office, please come to the chamber to vote. I'll call on Senator Frentz to report the votes of the members voting under Rule 40.7. Senator Frentz.
Thank you, Mr. President. Senator Carlson votes no.
Carlson votes no. Senator Frentz.
Senator Champion votes no.
Champion votes no. Senator Frentz.
Senator Clausen votes no.
Clausen votes no. Senator Frentz.
Senator Dietzick votes no.
Dietzick votes no. Senator Frentz.
Senator Eaton votes no.
Eaton votes no. Senator Frentz.
Senator Eakin votes no.
Eakin votes no. Senator Frentz.
Senator Fateh votes no.
Fateh votes no. Senator Frentz.
Senator Franzen votes no.
Franzen votes no. Senator Frentz.
Senator Isaacson votes no.
Isaacson votes no. Senator Frentz.
Senator Latz votes no.
Latz votes no. Senator Frentz.
Senator Newton votes no.
Newton votes no. Senator Frentz.
Senator Torres Ray votes no.
Torres Ray votes no. Senator Frentz.
And Senator Wickland votes no.
Wickland votes no. Senator Jasinski.
Thank you, Mr. President. Senator Anderson votes aye.
Anderson votes aye. Senator Jasinski.
Senator Coleman votes aye.
Coleman votes aye. Senator Jasinski.
Senator Dames votes aye.
Dames votes aye. Senator Jasinski.
Senator Goggin votes aye.
Goggin votes aye. Senator Jasinski.
Senator Housley votes aye.
Housley votes aye. Senator Jasinski.
Senator Senjum votes aye.
Senjum votes aye. Senator Jasinski.
Senator Ingebrigtsen votes aye.
Ingebrigtsen votes aye. Senator Jasinski.
Senator Johnson votes aye.
Johnson votes aye. Senator Jasinski.
Senator Lang votes aye.
Lang votes aye. Senator Jasinski.
Senator Limmer votes aye.
Limmer votes aye. Senator Jasinski.
Senator Matthews votes aye.
Matthews votes aye. Senator Jasinski.
Senator Osmic votes aye.
Osmic votes aye. Senator Jasinski.
Senator Rarick votes aye.
Rarick votes aye. Senator Jasinski.
Thank you, Mr. President. Senator Duckworth votes aye.
Duckworth votes aye. All members having voted who have the desire to vote, the secretary will close the roll. There being 34 ayes and 32 nays, the bill is passed since title agreed to. Next, we'll move to the 13th order of business, announcements of Senate interest without objection. The following senators will be excused from today's session: Senator Bach all day, Senator Franzen from 10:45 to 11 a.m., and Senator Latz from 10:45 to 11 a.m. Announcements of Senate interest. Senator Murphy.
Thank you, Mr. President and members. Is Senator Johnson available? I'd like to ask him to yield for a question.
Senator Murphy, Senator Johnson is not in the chamber. I believe he perhaps was excused for a conference committee, but he's not in the chamber at this moment.
Thank you, Mr. President. Is Senator Gazelka in the chamber?
Senator Gazelka is here. Senator Gazelka will yield. Senator Murphy.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you, Senator Gazelka. A number of people that I've talked with over the last number of days have been asking about the process of redistricting, and I understand that there have been some bills moved from the redistricting committee to the State Government Finance Committee. People have been asking what the process is because they want to be able to make sure they have a say in the matter and they want to follow it because they're very interested. And from my perspective, we want to have a clear and transparent process for Minnesotans. That is a way that we can ensure the maps are both fair and they are derived from community input. And so, Senator Gazelka, I am wondering if you can help me understand why bills are being moved from the redistricting committee to state government finance. Please.
Senator Gazelka.
Thank you, Mr. President, and to all members. This is very, very important. I do know that Senator Kiffmeyer and Senator Johnson are working with nonpartisan staff to figure out where jurisdiction goes. We're not going to get all the information, I believe, till September, which means the work will be done. Much of it will be done throughout the interim as we're moving forward. Once we come into session next year, the Speaker and I will likely pick an early date where we can try to pass the bill coming out of the House and Senate so that they can then work towards a possible agreement before the end of February. So that would be the general direction, but I would say you really do need to speak offline with Senators Kiffmeyer and Senator Johnson about what they're trying to do.
Senator Murphy.
Thank you, Mr. President. And would Senator Gazelka, the majority leader, yield for another question, please?
He will yield. Senator Murphy.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. And Senator Gazelka, I understand now that there have been a couple of bills related to redistricting moved from the redistricting committee to the State Government Finance Committee that are going to be heard in the next week or so. And so I'm wondering, Senator Gazelka, if it is your intention to also make sure that those bills are given a full hearing in the redistricting committee after state government finance. Thank you.
Senator Gazelka.
Mr. President, what we're trying to do is get the hearings. I think you'll likely have hearings in both committees with the process, but it's actually next year that we have to actually get it done. And so, but I do believe we'll have hearings in both committees.
Senator Murphy. Senator Kiffmeyer is also here and could maybe provide some input, but Senator Murphy, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. And if Senator Gazelka would yield for just one more question, please.
Senator Gazelka will yield. Senator Murphy.
Thank you, Mr. President. And Majority Leader Gazelka, as there appears to be hearings, at least in state government finance, on issues related to redistricting, but not scheduled yet in redistricting, and we have just a couple of weeks left of session, would it be possible, would you consider a joint hearing of state government finance and redistricting to hear the bills that are scheduled for hearing so there's not a loss of time in this very important issue? The people where I live, are paying a lot of attention to this, and they want to participate. And it is important for us to understand what the majority intends. And so my question for you, Majority Leader Gazelka, is would you consider joint hearings of state government finance and redistricting on these important measures?
Senator Gazelka.
Mr. President, Senator Murphy, we're going to let the process work. I believe that you will have hearings in both committees. Senator Kiffmeyer can confirm that that state government will do it, but then I believe it'll get kicked back to the redistricting committee. Again, we don't even have all the data until I believe September, but it is very important what we're about to do. Frankly, I believe it's been 50 years since the House and Senate and the governor have agreed without going to court, and so we're just going to have to play it by ear. But without a doubt, this is a very, very important time that we have to work through. The Senate will come up with a good version of redistricting. The House will as well. If we can agree with something together that gets to the governor's desk, that's a win for everyone. If not, then the courts decide, and that they pick a panel of judges to make what I hope would be a fair decision if it goes that way.
Senator Murphy.
Thank you, President Pratt. And Senator Gazelka, thank you for the overview and the little history lesson. We do have quite an interesting history on this question of redistricting. And of course, our work is not about the past, but about the future. Mr. President, would Senator Kiffmeyer yield for a question, please?
Senator Kiffmeyer will yield. Senator Murphy.
Thank you, President Pratt, and thank you, Chair Kiffmeyer. I understand that state government finance might be taking up some of these measures dealing with redistricting. Can you let the body know when you plan to meet and what your intention is for these proposals? Will they go back to the redistricting committee, or do you intend to bring them to the floor for debate yet this session?
Senator Kiffmeyer.
Thank you, Mr. President and members. So tomorrow evening at 5 o'clock, the State Government Policy and Finance and Elections Committee will be holding a hearing specific to all of the bills regarding redistricting principles. That's a basis and a foundation for moving forward. So that is tomorrow at 5 o'clock. To just mention, the Redistricting Committee here in the Senate has already held 2 hearings. The House has not, the other body, has not held any at this point. So the Senate has done, I believe, an admirable job of considering these things, bringing them forward, but State Gov tomorrow at 5 o'clock will be all of the redistricting principles bills that will be on the agenda for that evening. They will then go to the actual redistricting committee. So that is the process here in the Senate. Thank you, Mr. President.
Senator Murphy.
Thank you, President Pratt, and thank you, Senator Kiffmeyer. The Redistricting Committee, of which I'm a member, has had 2 hearings at the very start of the session where we reviewed Minnesota's history and sort of the overarching work of states with regard to the work of redistricting once we get the data. I have one more question, if Senator Kiffmeyer would yield.
Senator Kiffmeyer will yield. Senator Murphy.
Thank you, President Pratt, and thank you for indulging me. Thank you, Senator Kiffmeyer, for taking my questions. The principles bills that you are going to hear tomorrow night in state government finance, of course, are the foundation for the work that we will do going forward. And while we might not get census tract information until September, there is a lot of work that can be done lifting up those principles and informing and engaging Minnesotans around those principles so that when we get to September and when we get the information, Minnesotans are already prepared to act, because the time under which we will be able to do the work once we get that information is very, very compressed. That's why people have been reaching out to me, very, very eager to understand how the process is going to work, because they understand that their voices are being shortchanged because of the way the last administration managed the census. Senator Kiffmeyer, I'm glad you're going to do those hearings. I think that's really important. Is it your intention then to send those principal bills back to the redistricting committee for action yet this session? Will we take a vote as a body on the principles guiding redistricting yet this session?
Senator Kiffmeyer.
Thank you, Mr. President and Senator Murphy. In regards to the state government, we will be passing bills out of state government committee in regards to redistricting principles. They will then go to the redistricting committee. What happens from there is Senator Johnson, the chair of the redistricting committee, and he will make a determination as chair of that committee as to the future of those particular bills. Just to mention in general, a lot of people don't understand the connection. They think you can just do redistricting without the data, the critically important census data, which comes from the Federal Census Bureau. So until that data comes, we are, in fact, unable to do the actual work of drawing the lines, because you must have the population as it is distributed around the state of Minnesota in order to be able to do that. And yes, in between then, it would certainly be something that listening to Minnesotans in every corner of the state, to the center of the state, to every area, to every group, to be able to have them give input is something that I consider very important and is normally and customarily accomplished through the redistricting committee. So that has been done in the past. I've been part of that and an important part of it. And so I'm anticipating, without pre-deciding what the chair, Senator Johnson, will do, but that has customarily been the process in the past. Thank you, Mr. President.
Senator Murphy.
Thank you, Mr. President. And if she would yield for one last question, please. If Senator Kiffmeyer would yield for one last question. Thank you, President Pratt. And Senator Kiffmeyer, would you consider inviting and including the members of the redistricting committee to the state government finance hearing tomorrow night to conduct a joint hearing on the principles which are the foundation of redistricting?
Senator Kiffmeyer.
Thank you, Mr. President. And so at this time, we are not considering doing any joint hearings. As you know, right now we are in conference committees, so time management and doing all of that is very important. But it's also really important for state government members to hear these bills, to have their voice on them. It's actually a good thing. We're going to have two committees being able to have a variety of voices, and so we'll pass them out to State Gov. They'll go on to the redistricting committee where Senator Johnson, the chair, will decide further on how to proceed. Thank you.
Senator Murphy.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you for indulging me in these questions. It is important for Minnesotans to understand and follow along in the work of this critical issue, important to their vote, our elections, and our future. It would have been great, I think, to do a joint hearing to make sure that Minnesotans were able to use their time effectively on this point. I'm disappointed that Senator Kiffmeyer wouldn't consider a joint hearing, and we will continue to persist on this question to make sure that Minnesotans' voices and their participation are available as we move this issue forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Are there any further announcements of Senate interest? Seeing none, Senator Gazalka.
Thank you, Mr. President. Members, I'm convinced that the Senate will have a great redistricting bill. And so with that, members, I move that the Senate do now adjourn until Wednesday, May 5th at 12 noon.
Senator Gazalka moves the Senate do adjourn until Wednesday, May 5th at noon. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Senate stands adjourned.